Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this. My name is Richard Chen, and I'm currently a junior at Eastline High School. I play the violin in the orchestra, as well as the piano. Introductions aside, today I'm here to talk to you about one of the most fundamental techniques that you're going to see as the music you're playing gets harder and harder. The double stop and the chord. Now, I realize this is a very, very broad subject to be talking about, so I'm going to do my best to keep it short and sweet while giving you a good introduction. A double stop is exactly what it sounds like when you're playing notes on two strings simultaneously. When you've been tuning an orchestra class, you've more than likely played one. And when I'm referring to a chord, that simply means 3 or more notes. There are a number of challenges that come when you add more than one note into the mix. Obviously, first being, now you have 2 or more notes to keep track of playing in tune. Maybe fewer if there are open strings. And the fact that your bowing will need to adjust itself. Let's begin by talking about the level of your arm. Normally, when you're playing in one string, your arm takes on very distinct levels for whatever string you're playing. G, D, A, E. When we're playing a double stop, your arm level will need to be in between the 2 strings that you're playing on. Here is G, D, both G and D, G, G and D, D. When you're playing a chord, common practice is to break it into 2 double stops. In which case, you roll from the first intermediary position, here it's between D and A, and you roll over to the second intermediate position. In this case, it's between A and E. D and A and E. To talk about intonation, we're going to need to take a little music theory detour. I'll see you on the piano.
Alright, so let's talk about intervals. That's just a fancy way of saying the distance between any 2 notes. So, if an interval is the distance between any 2 notes, then this interval is going to be larger than something than like this. And this interval would be smaller than this. Now, how do we precisely describe the size of an interval? Well, to that we turn to what we can consider the unit of an interval, the half step. Thus, on the piano, that's just the distance between any 2 consecutive keys. This is a half step. This is a half step. This is a half step. And we can think of any other interval as simply a combination of some number of half steps. You'll notice on the worksheet that goes along with this video, I've included a chart that matches the name of an interval to the number of half steps it's composed of. Now back to the violin.
Alright, before we start talking about how to play each interval case by case in tune, I want to re-emphasize that you should take advantage of open strings wherever you can. Take, for example, this versus the first case is easier to get in tune because one of the strings is an open string. unless your open string is out of tune. That's just one note you have to worry about getting in tune rather than two. Okay, now we're going to be talking about cases where none of the strings are open. Starting with the interval of a third, you'll probably want to have the chart of intervals out as watch this part. So here I am playing a minor third. And then, for comparison, here's a major third. So your fingers are going to be closer together in a major third than a minor third. My violin teacher likes to refer to them as wide versus narrow spacings. For sixths, it's the opposite story. Here's a minor sixth and a major sixth. My second finger is remaining stationary, but my third finger will need to be slightly farther away from the second when I'm playing a major sixth as opposed to a minor sixth. Okay, next on the list we have fourths and fifths. For this, imagine both your fingers are on the same string for a moment. So you space them a whole step apart, which is not terribly difficult to do. You can always just think in terms of half steps, and then you just roll one of the fingers over to where you need it to be. And then for tritones, it's a pretty simple matter. Imagine your fingers are on the same string, scrunched right up next to each other. And then, again, just roll one of them over. In fact, again, in my violin lessons, we'd like to refer to this simply as the fingers being a half step apart, even though obviously they're playing a tritone, but their position is equivalent to that of a half step on the same string. Fifths are easy. Just use one finger across two strings at once. If you run into some issues about them being out of tune, first check if the strings are in tune with each other, and then just check the precise position of your fingers. For seconds, a major second will have a tighter spacing than a minor second. And then for sevenths, again, it's the opposite story. A major seventh is going to have a wider spacing than a minor seventh. Now, I have some examples prepared on that same worksheet that I was referring to earlier. On the first one, I've marked in the intervals for you to try. And as an exercise, you should do the same for the rest of those examples. Lastly, I want to quickly talk about chords. This is simply just combining the techniques that we've been talking about earlier. Let's look at that Beethoven quartet example. For that first chord, the interval between the lower and middle notes is a minor sixth, so that's a tight spacing. And the interval between the middle and the top notes is a major sixth, so we use a wide spacing. For the next chord, that's a perfect fifth. another major sixth, and so on. I'm sure you can figure out the rest using similar logic. I do realize that some of these examples, now that I'm looking at them, might require shifting. If that's something you haven't familiarized yourself with, don't worry about it for the moment. You can safely ignore that for now. And lastly, here are a couple of general tips that don't pertain to any interval in particular when we're playing double stops. Of course, it helps a lot to practice one note at a time. As oftentimes it's not both notes being out of tune, rather it's just one note. And breaking it down, or any sort of complicated passage down into its individual components, will go a long way towards making the whole thing work better. When we're playing stuff like octaves, which you'll probably see at some point or another, you'll want to pick one of the two notes to focus on. In some cases, it might be the lower note. In fact, it usually is the lower note, as when you're shifting higher, the spaces between notes are going to narrow anyway. That's just a little side thing, if you get to that. In any case, thank you for listening. Hope I didn't go on rambling for too long. And I hope I've given you a good introduction to what it's like to play multiple notes on the violin at once.